Hello, students. This is Professor Gore, and this is part two of the Roaring Twenties recorded lecture. And this part, we're going to be talking about a lot of the cultural, social stuff that's taken place during the 1920s. It's really kind of a fun part of the Roaring Twenties. So, what you'll see because of movies and the radio, among other cultural things, magazines, railroads, and later cars as more and more Americans began driving, you see a much more homogenous culture. And what that means is, you would have teenagers in different parts of the country that had similar cultural things. Where before this, you had kind of unique cultural things about different regions of the country, and you still have that to a certain extent. But because of mass media, you're going to see a more homogenous culture emerge in the 1920s. Another thing that you'll see as well with homogenous culture is because Americans are going to be buying a lot of the same consumer products. Kellogg's cornflakes, driving Model T Fords, using General Electric toasters, shopping at Safeway and A&P and Woolworths, listening to the same programming on the radios and so forth, watching Charlie Chaplin movies at their local theater. Also, one of the things that you see as well with consumer spending at this time is Americans began increasingly borrowing to buy products. So what installment buying is buying on credit. So you may be taking out a line of credit to buy a car. Now, the majority of Americans take out car loans today, but people take out maybe a line of credit to buy a new computer, a new television. Well, they were doing that to buy radios and early washing machines, early refrigerators, and so forth. And so they were literally would paying monthly installments. And so at the height of prosperity in the 1920s, the average income for the bottom 40% of American families was only about 725 dollars a year, which is about $8,200 today. After meeting the cost of food, housing, and clothing, they only had about $135 to spend on everything else. Many Americans stretch their incomes by buying on the newly devised installment plan. So they want some of these consumer products, even though they made very little income, but they began buying it on installments. By 1927, two-thirds of American cars were financed through monthly payments, and consumer lending grew to $7 billion a year, the 10th largest business in the U.S. And we still see that today with credit card companies. Electric appliances, refrigerators, radios, fans, irons, vacuum cleaners were all among the most important of the new products and had a dramatic impacts on women's lives. Okay. And so that made American lives easier. What most women still remained at home despite the growing number of working women. Electric appliances made housewives' chores less arduous, but did not greatly increase their leisure time. More middle class housewives began to do their own housework and laundry, replacing human servants with electric ones. The new gadgets also raised standards of cleanliness, encouraging women to spend more time doing household chores. Also, manufacturers spent a ton of money on advertising, about $2.6 billion a year. I don't even know how much it is today, but it's ridiculous. And they used a lot of psychology in their advertisements, much like we see today. I mean, think about how much people are willing to spend on a 30-second ad in Super Bowl commercial. You also have refrigerators. These are what early ones looked like in the 1920s. Okay. Here's what early electric gas range or electric oven ranges look like. This was actually a washing machine, Thor. And as I mentioned before in part one, the United States had the higher standard of living anywhere in the world, and so forth. Now, let's look at Henry Ford. Henry Ford really began in his line of work in the 1910s, but really by the 1920s made the car more affordable for the average American. One of the things he did with the Model A and Model T cars is he was able to produce them much quicker, and so therefore he's able to lower the production cost to offer it much cheaper for the average American consumer. So, for instance, he was able to lower the cost of a car from about $800 something to around $300 something just by lowering the production cost with the moving assembly line. He also paid his workers a $5 a day wage, which was the highest wages they had ever made. But he expected a lot of his workers, and it was very arduous. He also typically didn't hire Jewish people and had people who would be hired almost like as bouncers or thugs to beat up union organizers in his plants. Okay. So he was able to produce by 1927 a car every 24 seconds. Auto sales climbed from 1.5 million in 1921 to 5 million in 1929, a year in which Americans spent $2.58 billion on cars. And by the end of the decade, Americans owned 23 million cars, about 80% of the world's total, on average of one car for every five people, which is crazy. Okay. Now, a lot of industries affected by automobiles. You had rubber for tires, steel, glass, petroleum for gasoline with internal combustion engine, also chemical industries to make various products to go in cars. Tons of oil derricks shot up in California, Texas, and Oklahoma, and it provided 3.7 million jobs directly or indirectly. Highway construction became a $1 billion a year enterprise, financed by federal subsidies and state gasoline taxes. Rural life changed as it led to the growth of suburbs, as well as the first suburban shopping center in Kansas City. This changed American culture. The American Automobile Association, founded in 1902, reported that in 1929, about 45 million people, mostly a third of the population, took vacations by automobile. Like the movies, cars changed the dating patterns of young Americans as well. And so, automobile is the transportation innovation of the 20th century, more so than airlines. It is the railroads, what the railroads do in the second half of the 1800s, cars do in the 20th century. The United States would not have the culture that we have today. Students would not be involved near as much extracurricular activities that you're involved in without the car. You would not be able to get to point A to point B the way that you do and go to as many things as you do if it wasn't for the automobile. So also it changed advertising. Now the early cars were tend to be not reliable, and so this guy's on a horse carriage, kind of thinking the person on the car is foolish. That's going to change. This was an early cargo truck. You can see how small it is. It'd been tiny for me to fit in there. Families began going for leisurely Sunday rides. Okay. And then old historic Route 66, which I've actually been on when I was on a road trip in college, pretty neat highway, extend from Chicago to LA. You can see all the industries affected by automobiles. The Midwest was the big automobile booming area of the country, and Detroit at one point was the wealthiest city in the country at the height of the auto boom. Not anymore. So it also leads to the growth of suburban communities, buying on credit, which we still do today with car buying, and also changing of lifestyles. Schools, because of busing now, can be consolidated. The state of Arkansas has got several consolidated districts. The spread of suburbs, okay, and which I think is really cool. The fact that Americans can live further out, have a slower paced life, but they're able to drive into work. I used to live in a suburb of Dallas Metroplex. Also, people began wanting to move to more attractive states. You see a lot of people want to move to pretty areas. Also, it changed youth culture as well. Now, Pan American became really one of the first American airlines. Not the company American Airlines, but one of the first airlines in the United States. And this guy, it's kind of hard to believe, but Charles Lindbergh in the late 20s, early 30s was probably the most famous man in America outside of Babe Ruth or Jack Dempsey, because he flew solo across the Atlantic, and his nickname was Lucky Lindy. Here he is on the left. There's a parade for him down at the bottom in New York. Amelia Earhart, who disappeared suddenly in the Pacific, first female to fly solo across the Atlantic. Movies were huge. I don't think I really need to emphasize the importance of movies because how important movies are today. It became the fourth largest industry in the U.S. by 1929. Originally, when they made movies, early movie producers were like, why would anybody want to hear somebody talk in a movie? And then the first talkie movie came about in 1927 in the sense that it had sound, called The Jazz Singer, and then they blossomed. And you had a lot of famous actors and actresses. Greta Garbo, Julian Gish, Al Jolson, Charlie Chaplin were tremendously popular, much like you see actors and actresses very popular today. Here's Charlie Chaplin, Lillian Gish on the bottom, and Greta Garbo on the bottom left. Al Jolson was the guy who played in The Jazz Singer. Here's Clara Bow. She was a famous actress who kind of represented the flapper. And so she became in this movie called It. and the flapper was born. Flappers were decked out in short skirts and rolled down silk stockings. They wore makeup. They smoked in public, which was kind of scandalous at the time. Danced to jazz using the dance move called the Charleston, which is what they're doing right there, and flaunted their liberated lifestyle. They were really a small minority in the society, but when we think of the 1920s woman, we think of the flapper, just like we think of the 1960s, we think of hippies. The big studios at this time were United Artists, Paramount, and Metro Goldwyn Mayer, that were famous Hollywood productions. They were mainly run by Eastern European Jewish immigrants, such as Samuel Goldfish, and they were grossing about 1.6 billion in 1926. Now, one of the reasons why flappers became popular is guess how they portrayed women in movies as flappers, and so that's what helped take this off. Okay. And by 1929, the nation had about 23,000 movie theaters and were selling 90 million movie tickets a year. So I'll be honest with you, this is not my favorite hairstyle in American history. That was actually a bathing suit on the left side. Every time I show this to my students, like they really are dancing on a skyscraper. That was foolish. A lot of heavy makeup back then. My wife does hair and makeup for weddings, and she likes to say you don't have to put that much on if you put it on right. They also drink alcohol. If you remember Prohibition era, so a lot of them drink at speakeasies, these underground alcohol bars and clubs and so forth. All right, The Jazz Singer. You want to highlight this? This is the first talkie movie. It's one of the most highest-grossing films of all time. And it's actually where a white guy played as a black individual in the movie, um, and so forth. Now let's talk about the Harlem Renaissance and the Jazz Age. So this right here is a famous painting of jazz musicians playing in the Harlem Renaissance. It's a Harlem Renaissance painting. Here's another one, always at a speakeasies, underground bar. Cotton Club was actually very ironic. There was a white-only club in Manhattan with black musicians, and it was called the Cotton Club. Think about that. Here's an advertisement for Al Jolson's The Jazz Singer. And here are some famous jazz performers. You've got Louis Armstrong at the piano there, and there's the Duke Ellington. Famous musicians. Benny Goodman was another famous jazz player. So where the jazz age originated in New Orleans, and because you have the first Great Migration in American history, you have African Americans moving out of the South in large numbers, and they're moving into places like Harlem and Chicago and others, and so they brought jazz with them. Jazz was kind of a blending of blues and kind of a rhythmic sound. It's much more upbeat and happier than blues, and so similar to music genres today, the older generation resisted it, but the younger generation loved it. And it was the most popular movie or music genre of the decade for sure. And it's still today. You still have a few jazz nightclubs around the country for older people now. But the radio helped make jazz popular because it was the entertainment source besides movies at this time. Later, it's going to be replaced by televisions. People still listen to the radio today as we're driving in our cars and so forth, but television is going to surpass it in the home. And this helped contribute to a national culture. And about $50 to $150 for the first radios. 3 million homes had them by 1922. But later, by the end of the decade, 40% of Americans owned a radio. You also had mass circulation of magazines that were very popular at this time as well. And American families would sit around and listen to sports on the radio or these dramas on the radio and so forth, talk shows. Not like we see talk shows today, but you get the idea. See the reception areas. Rick Conrad is the first one to create a radio station out of his home. You also had Rhapsody was another music genre. Now let's look at sporting figures. Jack Dempsey, famous boxer at this time. Jim Thorpe, probably one of the greatest athletes of all time. Also was an Olympian and played football. Babe Ruth, the man, the myth, the legend, arguably one of the greatest athletes of all time in anything. Also, you had tennis and Olympics, and then Gertrude Darrell swam across the English Channel, which was revolutionary at that time. Now, all this change in culture worried rural dwellers and city dwellers who had been raised in small towns. They were also troubled by the powerful presence in American cities of millions of Catholic and Jewish immigrants from Europe and African American migrants from the South. Deeply felt tensions surfaced in the 1920s over immigration, religion, prohibition, and race. Okay, and so the 1920 census, I'm sorry, there's a typo there. For the first time, it showed that more than 50% of Americans lived in urban areas. So urban areas overpopulated rural areas. And you look at cities, I mean, New York City's got over 16 million today, but you can see that it was 7 million then. Today, LA has surpassed Chicago. Chicago's number 3, Houston's number 4, Philadelphia's number 5 in terms of our largest cities. 2,500 large cities were classified as at this time. During the 1920s, about 6 million Americans left farms for the cities. And you know the reason why? Jobs, jobs, jobs. By 1929, 93 cities had populations over 100,000 and so forth. Because political districts did not reflect this population shift, rural areas still controlled most state legislatures. Sharp battles over the use of tax dollars, especially for city services, intensified the growing cultural conflict between the two regions. Now, this one right here, the immigration restrictions. There's 2 immigration restrictions I'm going to talk about this time. The Emergency Quota Act of 1921, the Immigration Act of 1924. You want to highlight them, star them, take notes on them, make sure you know them. You typically will see them on a quiz or a test. Okay, so what it did, this is, and the country's been pushing for immigration restriction for quite some time. Congress finally passed it in the 1920s. What it did is the first one, the Emergency Quota Act of 1921, cut immigration quotas to 3% of each nationality as reflected in the 1890 census. So instead of the 1920 or 1910 or 1900 census, they went back to 1890. So basically, the number of immigrants, let's say there's 100,000 Italian immigrants living in the country. Only 3% of that number can come the next year, okay? So you do the math on that. That's not very many immigrants. And they were using 1890 census numbers to try to keep it down to a low level. And then all the National Origin Act or Immigration Act of 1924, all it did was cut it down to 2%. So it goes from 3% to 2%. Okay. Nativists had lobbied Congress to stop allowing migrant workers to come and so forth. And they really attacked labor unions. Still, American employers in Texas and California loved migrants coming over from Latin America because of the cheap labor source, and they convinced Congress to not stop it. So really, the anti-immigration sentiment was aimed at Southeastern Europe. Okay, so you want to highlight that. It kept immigrants out, particularly from Southeastern Europe. It doesn't affect Latin America as much. Now, the Great Depression, though, nobody wanted to come to the United States. Immigration just quits anyway from Latin America. And look at all the places where people were coming from in Europe. Wow. So you see that number plummet as a result of the Emergency Quota Act and the Immigration Act of 1924. All right. So one of the things that arises at this time, unfortunately, as well, is the height of the Ku Klux Klan in American history. So this adds to the tensions of the decades. And when we see Klansmen riding around in white sheets and so forth, this is really from 1920s. They weren't dressed that nice in the Reconstruction time period. So what ends up reviving the Ku Klux Klan is a very infamous movie called The Birth of a Nation that came out in 1915. That was actually done by one of Woodrow Wilson's roommates in college. He did a private screening at the White House and said it was the best movie ever made. But it was a group of Southerners, it was a controversial film that glorified Southern Democrats and basically made out the African Americans and the white Republicans as exploiting and corrupt and all this other stuff. But what happens is on Stone Mountain outside of Atlanta, the Ku Klux Klan began to revive. It found a significant support in the far west, the southwest, the Midwest, and especially Oregon, Indiana, and Oklahoma. If anybody else is surprised it was in Oregon, you're with me. The Klan of the 1920s did not limit its harassment to blacks, but targeted Catholics and Jews as well. They used arson, physical intimidation, and economic boycotts. The new Klan turned to politics. Hundreds of Klansmen won election to local offices and state legislatures. And at the height of its power in 1925, the Klan had over 3 million members, including a strong contingent of women, I know that's crazy, who pursued political agenda that combined racism, nativism, and equal rights for white Protestant women. After 1925, their membership declined rapidly. Go figure, because it was due to corruption within the leadership who were embezzling money. Well, bad people end up doing bad things. Nonetheless, the Klan remained strong in the Jim Crow South, and during the 1930s, some Northern Klansmen supported the American Nazi movement, which shared its anti-black and anti-Jewish beliefs. Whoa. Now, last topic we're going to cover is the Scopes trial, as well as Prohibition. Now, the Scopes trial, which is pretty interesting at this time, it really heightened the tension between religion and science. Now, what happened was Darwinian evolution, which was theorized by Charles Darwin, who wrote his On the Origin of Species in 1857. Several states had passed laws that made it where it was illegal to teach the theory of evolution in schools. So the American Civil Liberties Union wanted to challenge that law, and so they decided to kind of set up a case where they could challenge it. So John T. Scopes, here he is on the left. He was a baseball coach and a science teacher. Basically, what had happened was they asked him, would you be willing to teach evolution in your classroom? He said, yeah, sure. And they said, look, you're probably going to get punished for it, and we'll pay for your legal fees and take it up on your behalf. Well, what's ironic, two things. One, Scopes actually never taught evolution in the Tennessee public schools. He was absent the day that he was supposed to, but it was on his board, and so they challenged him on it. He was actually sick. Secondly, which I found ironic, the textbook he was teaching out of actually encouraged eugenics, okay, which is trying to prevent certain groups like minorities or mentally and physically disabled from reproducing, to try to weed them out of the population, which is actually influenced by Darwinian evolution and so forth. But that wasn't what was controversial. What was controversial was the fact that he was teaching Darwinian evolution. Now, the SLU assembles their team of lawyers, and the prosecution assembles their team of lawyers. Clarence Darrow, arguably the most famous and talented trial lawyer of the first part of the 20th century, and was the big name on the defense team for John T. Scopes. William James Bryan, the great commoner who had ran for president 3 times, is on the prosecution. He was also a committed Christian. So what ends up happening is they have the trial in Dayton, Tennessee. The town of Dayton loved it. It was a publicity stunt, and they got tons of revenue from it, because all these people were coming to say that the courtroom was very hot and it was packed, and the media just thought it was a fascinating trial. So they go back and forth for several days, and then Clarence Darrow realized they're probably going to lose the trial because it was breaking a state law. But that wasn't the point. The point was to try to bring it to national attention. Maybe it would get changed nationally. So I had to read a book on this trial in college, and to save time, I'm going to give you kind of the most fascinating part of the trial was the last day. So Clarence Darrow and William James Bryan were actually knew each other and were kind of friends. Clarence Darrow helped William James Bryan campaign in the election of 1908 as a Democrat. Darrow said, hey, will you be willing to testify on the stand as a defender of Christianity? And Bryan said, I will, so long as you get on the stand and testify as a defender of atheism. So Bryan gets on the stand first. Darrow peppers him with questions, asks him a lot of difficult questions that he can't answer. For instance, so how could Jonah be in the belly of the whale for 3 days and not, be digested and eaten and so forth, and yada, yada, yada. So Bryan he's asking him a lot of tough questions. He's not able to answer them. Bryan is expecting, okay, well, I'll get down off the stand and I'll be able to question Darrow on atheism. Well, Darrow actually concedes the trial and says the prosecution wins. So Scopes gets fined like $10 or $100 or something, and ACLU pays for it. That wasn't the point. They actually didn't matter if they won the trial. They were trying to bring it to national attention. So they lost the battle. But what happens is when the war over the next decade, every state gets rid of that, or that had it gets rid of the prevention of teaching Darwinian evolution. So if every time you see the scopes of the monkey trial, what it is a cultural conflict that was a legal issue during the 1920s. Happened in 1925. Okay. Now, prohibition. Ironically, the prohibition was supposed to end the consumption of alcohol. It actually increases it. And so it was called the Volstead Act is what enforced the 18th Amendment. So anytime you see the Volstead Act, just think prohibition. It was one of the great flops in laws in American history. And so what you would have is you'd have politicians who would vote dry, which means they'd vote for prohibition, but then they would drink in private. And what happens is it leads to underground crime that increased rapidly, the mobsters. In fact, if you've ever been to Hot Springs, oftentimes mobsters from New York or Chicago would come there like Al Capone or Meyer Lansky or Lucky Luciano. When things would get hot in New York or Chicago with the law, they would come and hide out in Hot Springs, particularly at the Arlington Hotel. There's actually a underground escape tunnel for cars to get out of there. So there are about 100,000 speakeasies in New York City alone. These are underground bars. Doesn't mean they were literally underground, but they were just kind of hidden. What happened is these big crime syndicates would just pay off judges, and law enforcement looked the other way. But what ends up happening is Elliot Ness, who worked for the United States Treasury, decided to go after the biggest and most infamous mobster in American history, Al Capone. Now, he was too clever to get him on actually bootlegging, which what he was is he would go get the alcohol from Canada and then bring it, and then they would sell it to speakeasy owners. And so he made a ton of money and was also murder and so forth. If you ever heard of St. Valentine's Day Massacre, his men dressed like cops gunned down a rival gang with Thompson machine guns. But what happens is Elliot Ness worked for the U.S. Treasury Department, was able to capture his bookkeeper and prove that he was making millions of dollars and then not paying any income tax on it. So they actually sent him to Alcatraz for not paying his income tax. So they couldn't get him on bootlegging. They got him on income tax evasion. And he died of syphilis at Alcatraz prison. You look at the arrests that increased because of alcohol. Here's what a speakeasy looked like. So one of the things that really caught the American attention was the kidnapping of Charles Lindbergh, the most famous man in America. His child, it was a young baby, and what ends up happening is they discovered the child several miles away, but they passed a federal law in 1932 that's called the Lindbergh Law that made it an interstate abduction in certain circumstances. If you kidnap a child, it's a death penalty offense. So pretty crazy. Now, the Lost Generation were there's two groups here called Lost Generation. One is World War I veterans returning home. Secondly, were a group of American writers. I had to read some of their books. F. Scott Fitzgerald, almost every high school kid reads The Great Gatsby. Ernest Hemingway, I read The Old Man and the Sea when I was in high school. Some of you may have read The Sun Also Rises. William Faulkner is another famous Lost Generation writer, and so forth. But their writings represent the kind of disillusionment of American consumerism. You see that especially with the ending of Great Gatsby. Gertrude Stein was a famous female author. Now, the Harlem Renaissance became this tremendous revival culturally of African Americans, and it started in Harlem in New York City. And it was with music, with the jazz age, art. Some of those art pieces I showed you, there's a ton of them. Writing, particularly in literature, and especially poems. Now, this is, I think, probably the most famous poem of the Harlem Renaissance from Langston Hughes, where it's called I Too. He says, I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody will dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. And he's right. Today, as an American society, we are ashamed about how African Americans have been treated in our country's history. So this is a fairly accurate poem. There he is on the top left. Zora Neale Hurston was probably the most famous female Harlem Renaissance writer, and then James Weldon Johnson. Probably not quite as famous as Langston Hughes, but still a very talented and popular writer. Now, last thing we're going to talk about, and then in part three, we're going to talk about the stock market crash in the 1920s, is Marcus Garvey. So we've already talked about Booker T. Washington and Webb Du Bois. Marcus Garvey becomes more popular in the 1920s. He was an African-American leader that founded the United Negro Improvement Association. And what it did is he's like, you know what, we're not going to be able to find equality here in the United States. Let's return African-Americans back to Africa. And he kind of promoted this black unifying nationalism and so forth. And later influences other decolonization movements actually in Africa after World War II. He founded his own steamship line. It was called the Black Star, and it would take African Americans back to Africa. He does go to prison, unfortunately, though, for mail fraud, and then later President Coolidge pardons him. Here is Marcus Garvey. And we'll stop there for part two, and we will get to part three